Hello? Okay. Corporations are alive. We give them rights that we accord living things or animals. We give them the right to life. We allow them autonomy in their decisions, to live freely. We give them the right to reproduce. We allow them to give birth to subsidiary companies. And we allow them the right to debt. As an autonomous being, if they go bankrupt, we don't run after the investors because we consider them autonomous beings. What we can't accept in proposition side is the idea that corporations have civil rights, such as free speech and expression and the like, that we accord to humans and not animals. So before we contextualize this debate, what is this debate about? We think that we're going to talk about how the world is better when corporations are not considered people, and how they don't think, rationalize, or operate in the same way that people do. Some definitions. By corporations, we mean entities created by investors to push for profit or agenda. So these can be profit or non-profit organizations such as Save the Children, Inc. No thank you, which pushes for their political agenda in the political sphere. Second, by people, we mean beings with civil rights. I've explained to you what those civil rights are earlier. Now let's contextualize this debate. Because in 2010, the US Supreme Court was faced with the case Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. The question was, should we restrict the amount of campaign donations from corporations? The court ruled on a 5-4 split that corporations are covered by free speech laws and as a consequence allowed the movie, No Thank You, to be broadcast across TV stations in America. This was a politically motivated movie that was fully funded by corporations and 501c charities. 501c charities means that you are basically a certified official charity and considered a corporation as well. So this means in practice that campaign donations by corporations to parties are not subject to inquiry as well. Meaning that they can't deny No Thank You them from funding electoral candidates or questioning their motives for funding as well. So we say that extending No Thank You, the civil rights of free speech and unlimited political participation by companies is unconscionable. We think that corporations should not be considered people. And we give you 3 reasons why this is wrong. First, I'm going to talk about why, if you consider them people, they have undue influence. Second, I'm going to talk about the image of elections. My deputy is going to talk about national sovereignty. So let's move on to our first argument. But before I move on, yes.
Would you allow the view of incorporation to be lifted sometimes or all the time?
Sorry?
Would you allow the view of incorporation to be lifted sometimes or all the time?
Oh, so we wouldn't, what do you mean? Anyway, so we're saying that, let's move on to our first argument. So, on how there's an undue increase of influence of corporations. I don't know what "feel" means, I'm sorry. So, elections are about representing the voices of people equally. It is a space where all men and women are equal in the voting process. We don't think that corporations are persons, because unlike ordinary persons, the machinery of corporations is so immense that they can turn political discourse around issues that benefit them, meaning that they can manipulate legislation and political discourse to benefit them and suit their motives. Did you ever wonder why in America, for example, it is very easy for politicians, no thank you, to support more tax cuts for corporations, even though it is an extremely unpopular policy hated by 99% of the people. That is because corporations have the power to lobby, while these politicians are in Congress or Senate. That is bad enough, but what makes it absolutely worse is the fact that they can give as much money as they can to political parties because they are considered political creatures. An ordinary citizen would typically support one political party, but these corporations, because of their vast networks, their numerous constituencies, and influence on the market, get to give money across the board to all parties. Meaning, no matter who wins or loses, no matter who the majority votes in, the corporation still wins because they gave money to these people. Before I move on, yes.
In terms of removing the veil of corporation politically, are you also going to do it by making sure that board of directors are liable when the company goes bankrupt?
No, we're still going to give corporations limited liability. I said that in the start of my intro where we give them the right to debt, meaning that as an autonomous being, we don't run after investors. So that's what you meant by veil of corporations. Anyway, let's move on. So we say that, have you ever wondered why it's so easy for people to support things that are hated by, for politicians to support things hated by 99% of the people. I think that's because corporations have the power to lobby, while these politicians are in Congress or Senate. So it's bad enough, but we think that it's absolutely worse when they can give as much money as they want to these political parties because they are considered political creatures. Because the main reason why this is harmful is that like, for example, in America right now, a high school teacher can get tenured, meaning they become a permanent member of the school that they're working for, after 2 years of breathing, essentially, because it doesn't really necessarily matter how good of a job or how bad of a job they do, but as long as they're there, no thank you for 2 years, they're already considered a permanent member of faculty. And that's why most studies unanimously declare that American schools are underperforming. The quality of education is tied down to teachers who don't do anything. In fact, there are many centers in high schools in America where teachers who are so bad are not allowed to teach, but just sit around in the school and do nothing, but are still paid fully because of their tenure status. How can they get this? It's because the National Education Association, a corporation made up of teachers, is the second largest contributor to Democrat and Republican teachers, second only to the National Rifle Association. Good luck passing some gun control laws. So yeah, basically, no matter who the majority votes in, no matter who the public will support, these corporations can still get their laws passed. They can still manipulate legislation. No, thank you. Take, for example, how GE owns MSNBC, and since GE makes weapons, MSNBC broadcasts pro-war propaganda so that GE can profit. So, no, thank you. So we think that at the same time they're giving money. So what's the problem with this? We think that first it dilutes the voice of other individuals in the electoral system in an unprecedented manner, more than any single individual can ever do. So they're not people because of this. This asymmetry of power is dangerous in a democracy. Corporations are not persons because their power is significantly greater than any other person in the world. No, thank you. In fact, some of these corporations are richer than some countries. Second, it causes disenfranchisement of ordinary people like you and me in the electoral system. We feel that our vote is less significant now because parties follow the whims of their corporations anyway. Third, corporations are able to influence to a large degree people who are supposed to regulate them. So does it surprise anyone that the former CEO of Goldman Sachs, Henry Paulson, is one of the people responsible for the financial collapse, became the USA Secretary of Treasury? We think that corporations are less like human beings, more like, I don't know, Thor. Second, it means the elections of image of elections in general. Because we could say that credibility is not only about being clean, but also looking clean. Say that people cannot believe in the government. That doesn't necessarily stand for their aims. So it's not just so we think that it's not necessary to have corporations fund candidates, and so that we don't question the motives of the people in office, so that the motives of these people are not questionable. It's more in black and white. So we think that what happens when we allow corporations to meddle in legislation, and we say that the legislation will get meddled in because these corporations owe so much to the people. We think it's a quid pro quo system where the corporations scratch the political candidates' backs by funding their elections right now, and in return these people will support policies that are in favor of corporations. We think that these people will always change legislation because they want funding for preceding elections. We think that corporations should not be considered people, and we think, how can we allow corporations to use civil rights to not help civil society? How can they be considered as persons? Proud to propose.
Yeah.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 23 seconds. I thank the Prime Minister. I would like now to call the Leader of Opposition to open opposition case. Testing. Ladies and gentlemen, Sawadika Tok Tok Ko. So, I'm extremely proud to be able to debate the finals of the 3rd TWSDC Debating Championship this year. So this debate is about two things, right? Which is firstly, corporate parenthood, which also extends to firstly, limited liability to the board of directors, and secondly, being able to fund political campaigns. Before that, let's define what is the stance that the opposition is willing to take in today's debate. Firstly, we're willing to defend status quo, where there is already a mechanism to mitigate harms that the government team has already proposed, such as lifting the veil of incorporation, which they clearly didn't prepare, and extending the liability to these board of directors, the body that is directly in control of these corporations. So when we lift the veil of incorporation, firstly, when there's inaccurate corporate records, secondly, when there's misrepresentation of facts, thirdly, when there's criminal liability, and fourthly, fraud. Basically, these criteria include the malicious intent of these individuals, and that's why the government is able to lift the veil of incorporation to make these individuals liable for their own actions. And this is what we're on-site opposition willing to stand for. But before that, let's rebut what the proposition has brought to today's debate. Firstly, they told us, and their main case was revolved around how corporations shouldn't be allowed political funding. On the first level, they told us the majority of people's vote will no longer matter, because now the corporation will only have, certain policies, and the politicians are going to be biased to certain policies that only favor these corporations. On the first level, these politicians can already appeal to other corporations or other companies. So there's automatically the kind of counterbalance of financial power whenever there's an alternative voice. So there's already a check and balance within the status quo. But secondly, about how they can manipulate policies. We say that when large companies or corporations can already affect people or their daily lives and already have a large influence over people's lives, and this was considered by both sides, in a way you can already influence the kind of policies that can also affect people's lives. On a third level, even if the policies were manipulated in somehow or some way, there's a huge biasness towards this corporation, eventually these policies will be debated in Congress anyways. So you can vet out any kind of sole biasness for these policies, because ultimately these politicians are going to bring their policies towards Congress to be debated over and over again. So we think there's already a check and balance. Fourthly, you also create a kind of discourse that people ultimately know, because the money comes from a certain corporation or a certain company, so people can still choose to support that political candidate or not. So there's a lot of form of check and balance within status quo that already allows discourse, that already allows the policies to not be so vetted out towards a certain biasness. So we don't see how is that so detrimental on-site opposition. But I have two arguments for you today. Firstly, sit down please. Firstly, why are corporations akin to a single legal entity? And secondly, the economic benefits of corporate personhood. Before I guess.
How is there a check and balance when the Republicans and the Democrats are fighting for the same thing as the corporations, which are not necessarily the same interest as the people?
No, obviously there will be a same interest, because why? The kind of more the policies that cannot be manipulated, because ultimately when it's debated over and over again in front of a large audience, in front of your people, in front of the national, your entire country, so how is that not vetting out the kind of biasness you have towards a certain corporation? And that was what your entire argument was revolved around. But on my first argument, why are corporations akin to a single legal entity? Firstly, we believe that people shouldn't be deprived of their constitutional rights just because they're in a corporation. It doesn't mean when you're in a collective body, you automatically lose that right. We allow corporations to be sued or to sue. That means you also provide a single entity for easier taxation or regulation, which also simplifies complex transactions. But secondly, why we should punish the corporations and not the individuals? Because why? The corporations made the decision collectively, so the compensation should also come from corporate funds. If it's malicious on-site opposition, we can already lift the kind of veil of incorporation and make the body of directors liable. Most of the time, it's always a bad decision making that corporations always make. Like example, they cause certain economic downturn or product malfunction or even unforeseeable circumstances like the BP oil spill. That is where corporations are responsible as an entity to compensate the people as themselves. So it's a collective compensation they should give to the people. But thirdly, states also treat compensations like any other people legally, like taxation, which is a source of revenue for the state. So states also benefit from these corporations, so that it should be considered a legal entity. But on the fourth level, it's also difficult to distinguish the kind of liability, because there's a lot of bodies within a certain company, like active shareholders or sleepy shareholders or the board of directors. So how can you punish a person when there's a minimal responsibility, or sometimes these persons can also be dissented when it's a cooperative decision as a collective entity? And that is the question that government must answer on their side. But my second argument will be revolved around this, the economic benefits of a corporate personhood. Because today we're not just going to debate about political funding, but we're also going to debate about why corporations should be considered as a person. So the economic benefits of corporal personhood is number one. When you make body of directors liable, when their assets is on the line, there's a huge consideration of the risk they're taking in the company. That means you only make the entry of starting of new businesses extremely difficult when liability is involved. Because now every time you make a decision, you have to calculate the kind of risk. Means that they're less likely to create new companies to protect in order to protect themselves. What does this do? This ultimately will disincentivize businesses to continue to start up. Why? Because if you keep on, when people are considered being liable for every single of their actions, then you don't make them incentivized, or you don't incentivize them to start up their own businesses to generate kind of growth within the economy. And this is extremely bad. Why? Because in the economy, you reduce the kind of spurt of growth of new businesses. It could provide so many jobs for people in the country to increase their income, to be able to survive, or they could use the kind of manpower within a certain country. We think that citizens also benefit from this corporation because why? Number one, they have cheap goods, and number two, they also enjoy economic benefits. When there are new businesses starting up all around, they can get those kind of services from these corporations. But we call it NEP or other.
Exactly, we agree with you. That's not the debate we've been debating. We've been telling, we don't see how this is part of the debate because we told you we agree about these economic benefits, and that's not the criteria we use to define a person.
The difference between opposition and government team today is you will extend the liability to the borders of directors. That means you make them directly responsible for the actions that they're taking, and that is bad. Why? Because when someone sues the company and the company already has to compensate, if the company isn't able to be compensated for the harms that they get, so the board of directors then have to compensate for that very harm. And we think that's bad on several levels. Why? Because you disallow them to create new businesses to start up or to generate the kind of economical progress that we want in the nation. Because ultimately, the citizens also benefit from these corporations, which I told you they enjoy a vast majority of economic benefits of new corporations that start up in the economy. So not only that, on the second level, you deter people from making risky decisions that will ultimately benefit the economy. Sometimes risky decisions have to be made by a corporation because when the business risk is involved, you also benefit in the economy in the sense that sometimes corporations have to make the kind of decisions or to take the kind of calculated risk that will benefit the economy. That ultimately will also provide the kind of healthy economy that we want. What has side opposition for you today? We told you that corporate parenthood ultimately revolves around two things. Firstly, the kind of limited liability to boards of directors, and secondly, the ability for them to fund political campaigns, which ultimately also benefit the kind of economy and people within the country. We're extremely proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 11 seconds. I thank the leader of opposition, and I would like to recognize Deputy Prime Minister to defend the government case.
So yeah, the biggest problem in this debate, which has been pretty clear early on, is a strategic error, because we're not debating the same debate. You see, opposition comes up and actually thought we were going to debate about something else, such as investor liability. But we told you clearly on from PM's speech is that we think that we should not go after investors because of the same economic benefits that you talk about. But what we define people as people who have civil rights. And because of this civil rights, we think that, and because these corporations can't use them properly and think like people, they should not be considered people at the end of the day. And that's the debate we brought to you. But on their side, we see an entirely different debate. And because of that, we see a lack of clash. Let me go on with that in my level of argumentation. Because they talk about this legal entity and how there's so many economic benefits. We agree, but an entity is different from a person. You haven't told us why exactly an entity is suddenly tantamount to a person. We told you clearly on that a person is tantamount to civil rights, such as, giving funds to these political organizations, political parties. Therefore, can we really clash with this idea of economic benefits? Because we clearly say that yes, you protect the investors, you incentivize business. That's not our burden to serve. That's not the debate we chose to take. No, thank you. So therefore, we tell you that yes, it is a legal entity, but that does not prove that it is a person. Now, my second idea of rebuttal is this idea of available incorporation. This is also something that came out. This is also a different debate here, because they say that when you have malicious intent, we go after the directors, and they give us an example in status quo. Yes, but that does not mean that the corporation is a person. They have failed to link back to the idea of the motion and how they prove that they are people, and they think like people, and they act like people in the political sphere, or even in a business sphere, if that's the kind of level of argumentation they want to take. Moreover, they talk about how people can vote for, have people vote rationally. We agree, the average Joe can vote rationally. But how do businesses and corporations vote? They vote to push their agenda. We see that when they put money into a certain political entity, what they do is that they think of it as an investment. And that's different when you think of it as something as helping civil society. So therefore, we think that, they don't use civil rights as persons. So how can you consider them a person at the end of the day? When you think of it as a return on investment, you don't really think about, oh, does this help majority of the people? Does this help my neighbor, my cousin, or my friend? You think of it, how will this make me more money at the end of the day? Will this push my political agenda? So we think on that note, when you talk about civil rights, you have to take into note civil society. And if you don't take civil society into account we don't think you are a person, especially when we talk about corporations who do not think about civil society at all at the end of the day. But moreover, thirdly, it tells us, well, they affect people's lives, and there are tons of checks and balances talk about Congress. But we gave you an example here. What about when they want both parties? We say that there is no discourse because they both unanimously agree. No, thank you. And why would they unanimously agree anyway? It's because they need the money to sustain their power in Congress. To advertise, to keep in power, to push their parties farther in gaining progress. And we think that they'll rather take that money than not take it and push on something else. Because we think that if they can make the power, they're willing to give in to some concessions of these companies. Otherwise, why would they give in their money anyway? Once again, think back to incentive. That's why they fund these political parties in the first place. Moreover, it tells us, well, people can choose the parties, another check and balance. They can choose a party, but will a difference in party really change legislation? That's another question they have failed to answer on their part. Because we think that if you're both able to, if you both push for the same policy, such as the teachers' organization example, we think that you don't really have a choice, and you're at the will of these corporations. Before I move on, sure.
Look, removing legal personhood is what contributes to your paradigm, right? But we see here in this paradigm that because you remove legal personhood, it is then when you remove it labeled as a person, but rather as an extension of a person that is on top. That's why you can take money from them. That is also the debate.
No, we don't, because we define legal personhood as a person who has civil rights. We don't think your idea of legal person, just because you didn't expect it, means you shouldn't debate it. We think what they've been trying to do is trying to switch debate onto their grounds, which I think is unfair, because a government gives the prerogative to set the debate here. So that's on the first level, but moving on, we're about to continue on with my argumentation rather. We're going to tell you how, by recognizing corporate personhood in our paradigm, which does not recognize their idea of going after investors rather, we think that it erodes national sovereignty. How? In the State of the Nation addressed by Barack Obama, January 27, 2010, he gave his decision about foreign companies giving money to their parties. What he said was that you open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. So then we live in a globalized world dominated by multinational companies. No, thank you. Multinational companies that have broad-based operations globally and multinationally, obviously. We say that companies base their operations in your state, and when they do, they form subsidiary companies that then become separate legal entities in your own territory. So we think that if just because I'm a company in America, it does not mean means that I can have a subsidiary company in, let's say, the Philippines or Malaysia. So we think that when we think of these companies that have full power to influence your political sphere and your legislation, how so? Like we say that, for example, if you look at China, what happens is that Chinese companies supporting politicians in companies cannot lobby for outsourcing. And we think that is an example of national sovereignty, because then both political parties will have to make legislation for outsourcing. And as we know, outsourcing also means that there are less jobs for people in your country, which may not be beneficial for your country. So therefore, by proxy of these parties giving into the will of these lobbyists, we think your national sovereignty to act upon what is best for your people is then eroded. Before we move on, sure.
Why can't different corporations fund the politicians that they prefer to create counterbalance?
Because we think that their motivations are quite clear-cut: profit. We don't think they have multinational organizations who fund companies to not profit. Otherwise, they'd be spending money to get no money. We think that's one of the reasons why that kind of paradigm does not exist. There's no counterbalance because because they see things as an investment. If you listen to my rebuttal, when you see things investment, you see return on investment, some kind of return. And if you fight for something to not get money, you're not getting anything in return, which is why that kind of situation will never happen. You need to analyze the motives of a company. if you so say their motives are profit anyway in your paradigm, we think that also applies with us. Moreover, we think, thank you. Just last January 7, 2012, the Supreme Court issued an upholding the prohibition against foreigners from making contributions to political campaigns. In the actual case, it barred a Canadian person from donating to Obama under the premise that he can unduly endorse American interests. So we think on that note, we can prove it to you how American interest is not the same as Chinese interest. But then again, we say that once you have these lobbyists, then the party's interest then coincides with national interest. And that's a problem here, because they're supposed to be the same thing. And by having that said, we think that you erode national sovereignty in the sense that you're no longer doing what's best for the people. You're reneging upon your responsibility to make sure everything goes well. Because that's what the social contract is there in the first place, right? You try to tell us that, well, we give up some rights in order to protect us. We hope that you put you into government because you know what's the best for us. So you give up some level of national sovereignty just for the mere fact that you're able to keep your party in power. And that's an opportunity cost these parties are willing to make. Because if they don't have power, they don't have to make legislation at all, which is the end-all goal. Meaning they're willing to give up some of their, principles for money so they can stay in power. So we think that when you have these parties, you have so many convoluting interests that it messes up the legislation system and it ruins your notion. We think in opposition, we accept a clash on how we set up the debate, not the clash that you thought we were going to set up. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 8 seconds. I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and I would like to recognize the Deputy Leader of Opposition to defend the opposition case.
Can everyone hear me? Ladies and gentlemen, let's be honest here. We both read the same Wikipedia page. We both know that there are two issues to this debate. This debate, when you say corporations are not people, entails two things. When you lift the veil of incorporation, which was what Gov was supposed to propose, there are two ramifications of this. First of all, you lift the veil of incorporation in terms of economically and legally. This is where we see that when you lift the veil of incorporation, the board of directors inside these companies will have to receive liability because they're no longer hiding behind the identity of a corporation because the corporation is not a person. Do you see what I'm getting at here? But even more so, we are also engaging on the grounds where we tell you we lift the veil of incorporation in terms of politically. Because when you lift the veil of incorporation politically, what happens is that that corporation is no longer viewed as an individual with the ability to have freedom of speech. And we engage on those grounds too. So in terms of what is this debate about, we don't think it's unfair because we also have the same Gov case and we also prepare for both scenarios. So it's a perfectly fair debate going on over here. So in essence, we'll deal with this debate on two grounds. We'll deal with the political aspect of this debate and why we should not lift the veil of incorporation there. We think that in order to get a rich and wholesome debate, side governments should also deal with the fact that they will have to lift the veil of incorporation in terms of legal aspects. And we think that's where we get a comprehensive and wholesome debate today. But going on to the point of rebuttal over here, I want to clarify today's debate. No, thank you, Donald. So going on to the first point of rebuttal, and this is essentially the only point of rebuttal, because the entire idea coming from first speaker and second speaker was identical. That the moment you allow corporations into the political sphere, everything goes to bollocks and rubbish. So the first point of rebuttal is, does giving corporations freedom of speech and ability to fund political parties, does it lead to annihilation of our political system? No, thank you. Money does not decide an election. Let's be very clear with this. Why so? Number one, the extent of your money goes to campaigning and getting your message out. So while there's an incentive to have a certain level of assets as a politician, that is not the deciding factor. Because number two, the main deciding factor of the election are the voters. Not the money, the voters. This goes on to the third level. If politicians are seen pandering to corporations and compromising the principles they fight for, when it's not in the best interest of people, what happens is that it taints their image. And what's the implication of their image getting torn down when they're seen as a person who's susceptible to corporations? People get disenfranchised, they don't vote for that politician. So while you may have the assets to spread your message, if people think that you're compromising your principles when you accept the money from the corporation, then you do not get the votes which are necessary, you lose general support. So we tell you that unlike this case, we think that the ability of corporations to fund is
not of corporations to fund political campaigns isn't as harmful as supposed it, because money does not decide the entire outcome of the election. Even more so, no thank you. Why is political funding by corporations actually necessary? Because number one, sometimes corporations go in line with the ideology of a political party. It was interesting how they talked about the NRA, because the NRA and Republicans are ideologically similar. So what happens here is that Republicans don't have to compromise their values when they accept funds from the NRA. This is important because sometimes the corporations on the second level are in essence just people hiding behind corporations. The more influence the corporation has and the more funds it has is also dependent on the magnitude of influence it has over the people and how much people support the corporation. So we tell you that in terms of political funding, corporations are in actuality just people supporting that kind of political campaign indirectly.
Sir.
Yes, go ahead.
How exactly can a person fund two companies, support two parties who fight for two opposite things?
Okay, this is interesting. This goes on to the third issue about funding both parties. Number one, politicians are never indebted to these companies, so they don't always have to carry out and be shackled to these corporations when they donate money to them. But even more so, if the interest of society is not in line with the interest of the corporation, politicians won't accept it. If it sees that accepting funds from a corporation that's ideologically contradictory to what you believe in, politicians are not going to pander to that because they lose it. This is what happens when they lose that image. And the idea on the fourth level is that corporations only aim to get profit, and profit by being profit-driven company is absolutely terrible. We tell you that not necessarily. In certain cases, corporations also have ideological things they fight for and a sense of corporate social responsibility. But even if they're just fighting for profit, we tell you that ultimately the people who choose to actually give those corporations profit will also make a decision whether what the company is selling is really what they need. And this is how it correlates to a political sphere. So going on to my points for today, let's clarify. Our first speaker has dealt with the first major issue of today's debate. We talked to you about the legal aspect of how we cannot allow the realty corporation to be lifted in terms of the board of directors getting legal liability. I will talk to you about why corporate freedom of speech is a right. And the conclusion to this argument is that the ability to fund your choice of a political party is necessary, even if you are a corporation. First, let's understand how a corporation is currently treated. We tax them severely as the government imposes all kinds of taxation upon corporations, but secondly, they are charged in court as a singular entity, and they seem to be fine with that, by the way. So in essence, people have the right to sue the corporation and company just as they would be able to sue a normal individual. But thirdly, these corporations still have to comply with the laws of a nation. So going on to the second level of argumentation, but before I go on, are there any last few eyes? If so, I'll start one later. I'm a nice guy. Going into the second level of argumentation. Why do corporations deserve a say in politics? Number one, because they are impacted by the policies passed by the government. What does this mean? In the same way, a person has some sort of stake in swaying government policies to take them into account inside the political calculus, we tell you that corporations should also be given the ability to have the same kind of say. Yes?
So if you think about it, the majority of people aren't corporations who are affected by the people you vote in. So should we be valuing more the people, the average Joe, in contrast to these corporations who affect legislation?
Donald, my friend, you really have to listen to the rest of the argument. But even more so, what happened to your friends, man? They can really talk well too. Give them a chance to POI. You're hogging everything. But going on, we tell you that second of all, it's morally right to give corporations to have a say in this kind of political sphere. Why so? In the same way we always give people the chance to defend themselves by having a say in politics, this should also extend to corporations. Because on the third level, if they do not have a say, governments can pass policies that are blatantly unfair to these corporations, and this is what we do not approve of. Because it doesn't matter if the corporation has absolute influence. As long as it has a minimal amount of say, in the same way a citizen should have a minimal amount of say, whether or not his views get taken into account. But second of all, policies that impact corporations also impact our citizens. Why is this important? Because many citizens are affiliated with corporations. Corporations are not just some kind of singular entity, they have roots in our citizens and people. We have investors, number one, who put money into corporations. And if these corporations have no say, these investors are at the mercy of government policies, which can make them lose their money and lose the very purpose why they want to invest in the company. But second of all, there are workers who contribute time and energy, and they should come under the broad representation of this corporation. But third of all, the consumers and policies can impact the nature of distribution of the product the company sells. Example, a tax on foreign vehicles in Malaysia increases the prices of of consumers too much. Corporations should be able to have a say in order to sway policies in their favor, because sometimes it's also in the best interest of consumers. Corporations will always want to make the consumer happy because the consumer is the one that gives the corporation its money. In other words, when you give corporations the ability to have a say in freedom of speech in the political sphere, this is where everyone, the citizens too, get a say through the means of broad representation by the corporation. Ultimately, this is a side that they don't want to engage in the second issue of today's debate, which I think is a very rich and meaningful issue too, but even more so, they have never told you, and in fact exaggerated the fact of politics and corporations when they're intertwined. We're very proud to oppose. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 22 seconds. I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and would like now to recognize the government whip to defend the government case.
This has been rather messy, primarily because the opposition does not want to tackle us on our definition of what personhood is. The problem here is that I did not hear if they challenged our definition, if they did, on what grounds. Is it a squirrel or not? They didn't really talk about it, they just said that it's different. And despite them saying that it is different and that they are debating another debate, and he just said, well, we read the same Wikipedia page, doesn't necessarily mean we're talking about the same thing. So they didn't really tackle us on whether or not corporations do deserve civil rights, because they didn't tackle about civil rights. They primarily talked about liability and economic growth. But so we shall tackle that despite them ignoring my Prime Minister's case. Because I have two issues here today. Whether or not these corporations deserve civil rights because of responsibility. Second being, will the world be better off? But before that, let's clarify some things. Let's see, this debate has been very technical here, so let's dumb it down a little. You guys know Harry Potter, right? Right? Harry Potter? Good. If I were to say a little human, a muggle, that is like us normal debaters, normal, not that smart really, we are muggles. The problem is that there are people like Voldemort, wizards and everything. These are corporations, people that can abracadabra you and you just die. And then there are people, the mudbloods, that have corporations, the people who own these corporations but are still people. Now the problem here is, why in the world would we give the same rights of muggles to Voldemort? It's not responsible, because Voldemort can just kill you like snap. That is what we're saying here. They are too powerful. And they are not tackling us here because they assume that Voldemort is a good guy, that Voldemort wants to help all the muggles. So we're saying, what if these corporations do not like you? What if these corporations are in fact selfish? Will the world be better off if Voldemort is the president? We think it is not. So let's go on to my issues, being whether or not they deserve civil rights. Because this main issue here was that they assumed that the power of the people is commensurate to the power of the corporations. Well, we already characterize as corporations as very powerful. They may be good, they may be bad, but they are powerful because they do not have the same influence as one person. And because of that, they are not individuals. And that's what we say, that we should not give them civil rights, because it's a responsibility that must be given to an individual and not a group of people. Because the problem is that they can't run a country because of their influence. This influence is too great. We do not expect them to run a country just because of what their beliefs. That despite, let's say, the public wanting liberal views, but if this big company that's a multinational company that has influence all over the world wants liberal views, conservative views, then you can't really do anything about that, can you? What do you have to say about that?
If politicians get voted because of the popularity of the voters, would they jeopardize their position because they're seen to be extremely biased towards corporations?
It's not about corporations here, not the people, not the politicians here, because we're saying that even if, let's say, the politicians don't do what the people want, well, frankly, the people right now don't necessarily like all their governments, right? Just because the people don't like the government doesn't mean that they get what they want. The problem here is that they'd rather listen to Voldemort than the Muggle. That's the thing. Who cares about the Muggles? They can't abracadabra you, but the Voldemort can. That's what we're trying to say here. Corporations have the power to push you down. They are powerful here. They do not want to concede that they are powerful. Because they assumed here that money is not, being rich does not equate to politics. Well, and they talk about how the people can decide, because the people can get angry, and that is a form of checks and balances. We say that's not true. Money runs the world. Funding equates to better adverts. Just like how my Prime Minister said, how Saving the Children released a video badgering Hillary Clinton, and because of that, well, Hillary Clinton was obviously badgered. She doesn't feel good about that because she's going to get less votes. So please, money is an avenue for you to advertise, to foster change. So don't diminish the power of money here, because money is how a country works. Because if a politician was poor, are you saying that he would have the equal platform as a rich politician, having to all the TVs and media and all that? No, thank you. No, thank you. No, thank you. So that's why they're saying here that the corporations are like people, because they have stands. They're liberal and conservative. But we have nothing against that. Of course not. We're not going to argue that corporations don't have their own stands. We're just saying that despite their stands, we do not believe that they can influence how a country goes on politically, because they are too strong. That they are not equal to a single vote of a person. No, thank you. So whether or not they decide this, we already proved to you how they are not responsible, how they are just too strong, how the influence of corporations does not equate to the influence of a single individual vote. That's where I move on to my second issue being, will the world be better off? No, thank you. See, there was this big clash on liability here, because they said, the board of directors should have less liability, because in status quo they have unlimited liability, and how that's not fair. And that they shouldn't be scared, and if they are not scared, it will pump prime the economy, because they can make bigger and better decisions. Well, frankly, that's not what we're talking about anyway, because this is not about liability, we're talking about civil rights. But let's humor them. Even if this was about liability, and even if we're talking about the board of directors here, frankly, you are not in the board of directors because you can't make decisions. Why would you be a part of the board of directors of Apple, let's say? Why would Steve Jobs be there if he couldn't decide when the iPod would be released? That looming fear of screwing up is good. That is because this makes you make the right decisions here. Because if they can volley around and make decisions left and right, and they know that they will not be liable, then why in the world will they do the right thing? These board of directors have a responsibility. Because of their powerful position, they need powerful responsibilities here. That is why it is equal. You do not give the responsibilities of a company to a single individual or a single employee. No, we give it to the board of directors, because that's how it is. Influence equates responsibility. That has been our stance here. And that's why the problem here is that the corporations here, because these votes are seen as investments, as my Prime Minister said, which they had no response to. Because the value supported by corporations does not necessarily reflect the values of the people. And that is why the problem here is that if they do have civil rights, that means the opinions of the public are not as good as the interests of the corporations. So even if they have CSR, even if they have this branch of the corporation that wants to talk about the people, frankly, that is not the majority of the corporation. That's just a little bit small, just to keep the people happy, just to make sure they don't get that angry. But please, CSR is for a good image, not for public good, but so that they will look good for the people. So that is different here. And then you talk about how the profits will trickle down anyway to everyone, and that will make the world a better place. Well, frankly, they have yet to explain how profit from a company will trickle down to everyone. Because are you saying that board of directors would give their salary or give their money to all these employees? They didn't even talk about it. They just assumed that it would. That's why we're saying public profit does not even equate to civil rights. And even if, let's say, they do trickle down, not everyone works for General Motors, not everyone works for GE. What happens is that if you empower these corporations, what happens is that the only ones who win are the people in that corporation. But what are the poor people? What are the poor people who want to be, want the society to be liberal? They are shunned by the conservative companies. So what, just because you're poor doesn't mean that you can run a country now? Of course not. So that is why we think it is unfair. So in these two issues on whether or not they deserve civil rights, we already said how they are not responsible enough, how they are just too powerful. And because of that, you must not give them the right of, you must not give them civil rights. And second, whether or not the world would be better off, we figure that if the companies, if they live in a world where the world is run by companies, that is not right. That we want to empower the people here. We want to give the responsibility to run a country, to vote, to the people and not the corporations. And if you want a place where everyone is happy, you don't give it to the rich people, you give it to us. To us, where we talk about empowering not just the corporations, but everyone, and especially the people who do not have a voice. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 13 seconds. I thank the government whip and now would like to recognize the opposition whip to defend the opposition case.
It's a huge honor to be in Thailand today so that we may enjoy a debate and to have a learning experience. But it seems that side government here is a bit confused about what the motion actually requires them to fight for. They need to fight for removing legal personhood. Indeed, this is an implication of what they are going to say. It is an implication that will lead to resulting in funding political campaigns. But another implication of this is not a definition challenge, because we do concede to the fact that we remove the legal personhood. But what happens here is that now the corporations are removed of the label of a person, and it is simply an entity by which the board of directors are extended to. That's why now we can extend liability towards these people, and that is what another implication about the debate is. We think that this kind of clarification is required on their side of the house because they seem to be a bit confused. So, given that we have two kinds of implications, and I'm sure more, but two of them are the main issues in today's debate, how do we best answer these questions? Two questions. Number one, how do we create the best democracy? And number two, what is best for business, and what exactly are we trying to achieve here? But let's take a look at the other side of the house, because we do want to argue both sides, because we want a rich and a wholesome debate. So they talked a lot about corporations and how they have too much influence on discourse. A few responses to this. The first response is that there's already a societal check and balance in place when you're always talking about discourse. That's why only good ideas will resonate in society. That's why there's no incentive for corporations to come up with bad ideas, because these good ideas ultimately have to go through society, and these are the kinds of things that result in check and balances, and these are the kinds of things that doesn't mean that the corporation holds absolute power, that just because they have a certain idea that it goes into place. We don't think that's the case. Sit down, sir. But the second response is this. There are always checks and balances, such as the Congress, because there's never anything that's set in stone. Policy doesn't go straight from the president or from a political party straight to the society. No, it always passes through Congress, and there's always discourse on the matter. But thirdly, this is a good thing. If we have more perspective, then only can we actually grasp the full situation, because ultimately we can't deny that corporations are a fundamental part of our society too, and they're accountable too. We think that when we talk about corporations, we need their perspective as well, because ultimately we never immediately accept their perspective. That's what is wrong from side of our government. Sit down. But secondly, they talked about financial power. Look, this financial power is only extended to these political parties when they are trying to campaign. So the maximum power that these government have is to influence your manifesto, but not that much. So but the idea here is that the government are indebted. But a few responses to this. Sit down. The first is that, number one, they only have finance that extends to the campaigning of these individuals. So they never really prove how, just because you have financial power means that once you get into office, we still have control over you. We don't think that's the case, because you wouldn't be indebted, because now your income comes from the office, comes from taxation, not from the corporation. So you get income to do other things and to make other things not from the corporations. Sit down. But other than that, we already have Congress to decide these things, so we can always delineate what is good and what is bad. But secondly, we think this can be a good thing as well, because when you take a look at corporate societal responsibility, for example, when we use media to propagate certain things, or when we dissolve monopolies, we think that there's a mutual gain to be gotten here. We can gain from both the corporations that want to, fund the political ideology, or when the political party can give back to these guys by funding society and by making this society a better place. But before that,
You talked about discourse. Can you please explain to us how the influence of a corporation is just as small as the influence of a single person?
No, look, the idea here is that discourse is based on ideas, and these ideas always have to go through society. Just because you're a corporation, or just because you're a person, you always rely on the fundamental basis of a principle or an idea, and these ideas are the ones that go through society, not the person who is giving it. That's the more dominant factor in this debate. But let's talk about incentive, because, let's talk about the third response to financial power, because there's no incentive for political parties to want to accept financial power or financial power from corporations that diminish their principles, because number one, you lose popular support, because it's extremely difficult to hide these kinds of diminishing of principles, because politically aware people and strange transactions that come out from corporations are always things that result in loss of popular support. But the second one is this. Now they talk about how people now will fund all the corporations, and no matter what happens, they win. But here's the thing, if you're on the same side as the opponent, then you diminish your principles, because now your core fundamentals are never in play anymore. That makes you look bad campaigning. But the fourth response is this: money doesn't necessarily equate to power. We think that was the fundamental flaw from their side of the house, because ultimately, when you want to influence a society to bend to what you want them to have, then you need to fight for them with principle, not with cash. So why would people sacrifice ideologies for money? Are you then saying that the conservatives would now legalize abortion just because they'll get more money? We don't think that's the case on this side of the house. But their third idea was this. It was on sovereignty, right? Look, people already have no power beyond elections. That's why you can't invade that much anyway. We don't think that the harm here is, we think the harm here was exaggerated on this side of the house. But firstly, there's already a social deterrence to, avoid these kinds of situations. Because when society loses jobs and when the whole country loses economic power, that is when the government is accountable for these kinds of decisions. We think that this kind of idea is completely flawed on the fundamentals. But secondly, if this really is an exacerbated situation, then we can always try these governments and we can always try these regimes under corruption. Because if you want to accept bribes, which is pretty much what I've heard from this side of the house, then we can try them under law. It's not like there's no counterbalance or that these corporations hold absolute autonomy over the society. We don't think that's the case. But on the idea of civil rights, look, sir, our corporations ultimately participate in society. When we take a look at a person, they are accountable to society, and that's the reason why we give them the power to select, their leaders. That's why when we take a look at corporations who are also participating in society, we think that it's important to extend this principle to these guys as well. But before that, go ahead.
Can you please explain how if a corporation would have civil rights, they suddenly cease to exist?
No, why? If corporations don't have civil rights, doesn't mean they'll cease to exist. That's not what I've been arguing. I'm saying that if corporations have civil rights, it's better for democracy because now you get everything. Now you get all the perspectives. And I'm trying to tell them that it's not just that since you're a corporation, you get absolute power. We think that's an assumption and an assertion from this side of the house, because ultimately they haven't proved how these corporations can control these people to such a great extent, and why there's already a natural deterrent for people to not want to accept these policies, especially when they undermine their core principles. But let's take a look at the second issue. What is best for business? Something that they were very recalcitrant in trying to rebut. Let's take a look at incentivization of business. For example, when we take a look at tax, you trade off certain money for societal good. For example, when we take a look at economic power, this is also a trade-off as to how you extend the business, right? So when you take a look at corporations, what are the benefits? Because they were really unclear on this. We told you really clearly. Number one, you create job opportunities, which is always the best interest of society. And secondly, you gain economic power for your country. We think that's extremely beneficial towards these people. But when you take a look at the board of directors and decision making, look, people already scrap any business that will contain any uncertainty. They can never know what kind of business model will have benefits if never actually put into practice. That's why under their side, you'll never have any progress because they are too reluctant to lose their own personal assets, which is different because the fear is much more closer to their heart and the fear is much more closer to their family and their lives. Ultimately, we were the side that wanted a richer and wholesome debate. Ultimately, we were the ones that took the debate.
The speaker spoke for 8 minutes and 33 seconds. I thank the opposition whip and now would like to invite the opposition reply to an opposition case.
When it came to corporate personhood, which is essentially what this debate was about, whether corporations are people or not, we found two very important issues which we thought was necessary to be discussed in such a prestigious tournament. First of all, the idea of political funding. It was something that we felt important too, because in the case of Citizens United, this was a very major issue at that time. And so we addressed them on this issue too, and we considered it a fundamental issue for this debate. But there's another issue which we thought deserved equal importance, and this was the idea of extending liability to the board of directors, something that's also in line with the veil of incorporation, something they failed to understand fully. We felt that was an important issue because currently board of directors don't have this kind of liability. And this was the same people that painted corporations as manipulative and deceptive, yet they are not going to go in line with this proposal, which is also consistent with the principles. We tell you they're not taking the full debate head on. So ultimately, in the end, both sides sort of dealt with both issues. We dealt with the idea of political funding, we also dealt with the idea of legal liability. And towards the whip, they also tried to deal with the idea of legal liability towards the board of directors. But let's go through the issues one by one. The main underlying principle for why corporations are not people was the idea that corporations, if given the chance to fund political campaigns, will ultimately destroy our political system, make us all slaves to corporations, and will take away our sovereignty, an obvious exaggeration. Because we told you, number one, the harm isn't that much, and we provided to you many cases where we can mitigate those harms. Why so? Because we told you that voters are the ones that decide the elections, not money. And what politicians may want to get money from these corporations, that's ultimately not in their interest if it compromises the principles. Because if it does compromise the principles, as much money as you get, it taints your reputation and you lose out on the general voters. And it becomes a decision. Are politicians going to always want to get more money, campaign and get more voters, or do you want to directly get more voters? Something they never responded to. So we told you, in essence, the harms of letting these corporations be able to fund political campaigns isn't as great as they try to paint it as. It's actually very minimal. But even more so, we told you what's the benefit of allowing these corporations to be able to fund political campaigns. We tell you that number one, this is a group that represents so many people, investors, workers, and consumers. We have to give them a say, and ultimately, the people in our society, the citizens, are the ones that are at mercy when the government makes policies that disenfranchise the corporation or are not logical. Because in essence, we told you that politicians are not really indebted to corporations because these are mere donations. And if you bribe them, as our whip speaker said, that's against the law. You can still make a choice to choose what you believe in, and you don't have to compromise your principle. But more so, sometimes these corporations work hand in hand with these political campaigns and political parties, such as the NRA and the Republican Party, where both of them support the use of guns. In that case, why is it so bad that politicians be able to receive funding from a corporation that's ultimately there for them too, and something that is good for them too? On this third issue, the final issue of today's debate, was either expanding liability to directors. And we brought it up from first speaker and had layers of analysis for you. And they never responded to it until with speaker. We told you why it can't happen. They tried to give you some kind of response, how people be more accountable, but we told you that new businesses are the ones that are most affected by this. New businesses are extremely hard to set up when the risk also goes to the board of directors. People are not going to set up new businesses, and this is especially important in an economy where we need our businesses to thrive and economic to thrive. Ultimately, we're the team that dealt with both issues. We dealt with the idea of political funding. We showed you its exaggerations at the very most. But more so, we dealt with another important issue, extending liability to the board of directors. We think that for this kind of debate, it's as much as corporations may seem as evil people to us, and this is general stereotypic perception, ultimately we are the people that make up the corporations. We're the people that choose to invest in them. We're the people that choose to buy products from them. We think that in this case, since corporations are ultimately us, why don't we give them the same kind of personhood rights? We're very proud to oppose.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 10 seconds. I thank the opposition replied, and I would like to invite the government reply to end the government case.
The biggest reason why we won this debate is that even if they prove corporations are great, they're going to help society, they're the best damn thing that ever happened, they still haven't proven to us why they are people at the end of the day. I mean, that's the biggest problem we have come from their level of argumentation. There's been a lack of tie back to people. And the only level of response we've heard from them is this whole concept of veil of corporation, which they never really explained. It was very big. They just dished out this economic jargon without really explaining what it means. So then they tell us, well, what about legal personhood here? Well, what exactly is legal personhood for you? We think just because legal personhood for you is economic liability does not mean that that's the debate we're having right now. Because we think that what we heard from their case is essentially a dropping of cases. From the first speaker, we heard this economic debate on how it's good for investing without telling us how it's proving. Just because it's good for investment does not mean that this entity is a person. But moreover, as we move on to the whip, we hear lots of late analysis and a little bit of a contradiction here. They tell us, well, you know, these politicians are not really bound by these bribes. Very late analysis. But then likewise they argue that they're not bound by these bribes, and it's good for corporations to get money. It's good for these entities to get money anyway. So that's the kind of analysis clash we heard late on. But moreover that, we think that we're not supporting bribes, obviously. But when we talk about a non-binding agreement, yeah, we can fund you now and we have no guarantee, but that guarantees you won't get our funding the next term. And I gave you that in my analysis. Their interest is to stay in power the next year. And that's a standing power, because if they're not in power, they won't be able to change legislation and forward the rest of their values. So we think we gave you an analysis of these parties. They'd rather swallow the bitter pill and, let's say, allow teachers to have tenure, which is seemingly a benign practice, in order for them to get money for both sides, because it is a concedable value. And we also heard the only late analysis we heard is this idea of abortion here, because they tell us that, well, they won't change, these totally polarizing opposites. We agree. We're not saying that they're going to support all ideologies, but we're saying that the matter of fact is that not all ideologies can, that not all ideologies can be supported. We say, what kind of person supports two parties? What kind of person has all the money to sway influence? And that's what we've been saying in the very beginning. Corporations are not people because the sway of influence they can put on their sole idea is improportionate to the the influence that can be swayed by a single person, the average Joe. So we think that's the debate we've been trying to come from. We told you that, yeah, corporations can push their idea. Yeah, corporations can do all these things, but why does that make them a person at the end of the day? We think that, right, is it really mutually exclusive as well to say that they can't, tell their ideas, improve discourse? We think that all they haven't really proved to us is why exactly this only exists in their world. We think in our world what we do is we make sure that discourse is not manipulated by money that the people have. And although they may say that money does not equate to power, money is still a variable into winning an election here. We think money, as I said in my first speaker's argument, is what allows you to have advertisements, awareness, pushing your agenda down people's throats in order to convince them in the upcoming election. So we say we have had no suitable response from them. And we think that when you think about that, we say that is not even the true sense of society. We think that a lot of times, do corporations really put people's interests at first? They haven't really told us why they care about the people so much, except saying they don't want to look like bad guys. But is that the first priority of these corporations? Is their first priority really CSR or is it profit at the end of the day? So we've heard no real concrete analysis to how corporations work. We've given you crystal clear characterization from the very beginning. Moreover, they tell us that, corporations can coincide with, certain ideals of companies. We totally agree with that, but why exactly does that make them a person? Why are we disenabling them from doing all these harms that they present? So we think on their side, they follow under two tracks. Firstly, the burden. Do these arguments really prove that they're people? But second of all, are their harms really mutually exclusive? Are there harms really saying that just because you're not a person does not mean you can't speak out your concerns? As an entity, you can still do it the same way. Like in the UN, for example, you can be an entity and speak out your concerns. You just don't have voting power. It's the same thing we've been telling them that they lack of response, lack of engagement, lack of fulfillment of burden, opposition side. We take the debate. Thank you.
The speaker spoke for 4 minutes and 19 seconds. I would like